it is quite daring to rewrite Shakespeare. Some writers have, over the past few decades, tried to adapt Shakespeare's plays to specific audiences, times, and contexts. Anyone, for example, who went to a theatre festival in which some Shakespeare plays were staged almost certainly saw renderings of his plays in modern circumstances. Say Macbeth in 20th century Africa, or Othello in, California, say. Cinema has also had its own attempts. Some of us might remember a film produced in the 1990s based on the play Romeo and Juliet, which tried to incorporate Shakespeare's own lyrics, own words, but into a very modern setting. But to rewrite Shakespeare entirely, as in take the tales of his own plays and rewrite them differently, is a new, and I would say quite daring endeavor. And that's exactly what publisher Hogarth Press in London had done few years ago. The purpose was not to change the plays or the tales, though some actually of the writers that Hogarth had commissioned did change the plays or the tales. However, the purpose here of this project was to add context. This is important. Shakespeare, as actually Adam Gopnik makes clear in a long and very interesting essay in The New Yorker, Shakespeare often ignored context. For example, Shakespeare never tells us really why Hamlet was so melancholic or gloomy, rather than being fiercely angry at the murder of his father. Shakespeare also does not tell us why Shylock, in The Merchant of Venice, of course, was adamantly rigid rather than being opportunistic. Of course, there have been explanations in the plays, often subtle, at times a bit more explicit. For example, in the case of Shylock, there was that very famous lengthy monologue in which he, Shylock, more or less explains himself. And many actors who played Shylock excelled in that specific monologue. To my mind, Al Pacino was particularly marvelous in his own take. Anyway, back to Shakespeare and his penchant for often ignoring contexts. Some would say Shakespeare, like many writers in his times, was an absolutist. In this view, goodness is always an absolutely good, and so those who are good are always so, and those who are evil are always or have always been so. Such absolutism is easy, but the age in which Shakespeare wrote was one of easy arguments. Actually, it's quite funny that Shakespeare is now seen as an immensely deep writer with major insights into human psychology, because he was not. Shakespeare, to a very large extent, was a simplifier. He almost always simplified arguments and reasons, and so to him, contexts were not necessarily a must. Indeed, in his plays, good is always good, evil is almost always evil, and that's it, thank you very much. No gray zones. We do not see much evolution of his characters. Context is different from consequences, of course. We see, say in Macbeth, the consequences of Macbeth's crimes. We see how Lady Macbeth loses her steely ambition and becomes ridden with guilt. But we do not know what made her be initially so full of this steely ambition that drove her to lead her husband to kill. But again, that was probably hardly important anyway for Shakespeare and the absolutism of his age. And that is exactly the purpose of this project, of this retelling of Shakespeare's plays. The objective is to get modern writers, or was to get modern writers to give Shakespeare's plays context, to tell us why Lady Macbeth behaved that way, why Hamlet was like that. But the project is one of art, not psychological analysis. And so the writers who were engaged in the project were not to boringly give us assessments of sanity of Shakespeare's characters. Rather, they were to, indeed, retell the tales, but perhaps with more subtlety, more context added. Of course, the results were varied, were different. Some results added depth to the circumstances, and more interestingly added depth to the characters. Some results took, or some attempts at retelling the tales of Shakespeare took the way of comedy, as in they decided to immerse their retelling of the tales into hilarity or surreal imagination, surrealist imagination, which some readers might find fascinating, others might find utterly distorting, such as in the case of Hamlet here, who in the retelling is no longer the Prince of Denmark, but a fetus, a baby, a fetus in his mother's womb, hearing what is happening in the world outside her. Now, details aside, and irrespective of whether some of the new takes on the tales are actually interesting retelling or a bit too wild flights of the imagination, especially for plays that most readers know very well, irrespective of all of that, I like this project for two reasons. The first is that the innovative renderings in this project present us with new plays altogether. Of course, indeed, these retellings are based on Shakespeare's tales, but they are in effect new works. So, all in all, the usage of creativity here was put to much more than having new twists, often more than giving a context. The creativity here was to often create full structures that actually stand on their own feet, irrespective of the actual plays of Shakespeare. And actually these retelling of Shakespeare's tales could well be read as independent works of art, irrespective whether or not one has read Shakespeare's originals. The second reason I like this project is that it's irreverent. It does not look at Shakespeare and his work as gems that must be touched with utmost care. This is good actually, because any work must be subject to both analysis and critique, even if most people consider such work heights of genius. Interestingly, some of the most influential English critics with close associations to venerable institutions such as Oxford University or Cambridge, they hardly ever approached Shakespeare and his work with any sanctity or veneration. Often their approaches were not only critical but also funny, basically making fun of Shakespeare and his world overview. After all, Shakespeare was a poet working for a theater company, entertaining the society, trying to make money, and it must be remembered, typically targeting, staging the plays not just to entertain the society but to entertain the elite, including the monarch. So, I think this project in general merits the attention of anyone interested not only in English or world literature, but perhaps before and after that, merits the attention of anyone interested in how contemporary talents approach older works of art, especially work that is seen as the canon, the most venerated in any field. This is particularly important in parts of the world where critical thinking is not very encouraged, where education often discourages open-wide thinking, and where the prevailing culture is hardly ever challenged. In such cultures, retelling old stories, rethinking about what has been traditionally venerated, reassessing it often with criticism, often with hilarity, is very healthy.